Lee Selwyn was a rising star in Los Angeles' vibrant late 1980s rock club scene, but in 1988, he would become the victim of one of the most disturbing road rage incidents imaginable. At 26 years old, he had already made a name for himself as a popular DJ, spinning records at some of the city's trendiest nightclubs. Lee grew up in the Los Angeles area, attending Van Nuys High School and living in Venice Beach. In the fall of 1988, he achieved one of his dreams. He had just opened a music club of his own, just mere days before his life was cut tragically short. Yet, Lee's vibrant life and promising future would be abruptly and cruelly halted. In early October 1988, just as he was celebrating the success of his new club venture, Lee became the victim of a shocking act of violence. It was in the early morning hours of October 8, 1988, that Lee Selwyn's life took a tragic turn. Around 2 a.m., Lee and three of his friends left a Hollywood nightclub after a night of music and fun, planning to enjoy a motorcycle ride through the near-empty Los Angeles streets. The four friends rode in pairs. Lee and a friend nicknamed Beachy followed behind the lead pair, Mike Auerbach and Rob Califoot. The city was quiet at that hour, and the rumble of their motorcycles echoed down the streets as they set off, unaware that danger was looming close behind. As the group cruised along, a vehicle came hurtling out of nowhere. A red and white pickup truck suddenly raced past Rob, nearly sideswiping his motorcycle. Startled and enraged at the close call, Rob pulled up alongside the truck when they all stopped at the next red light. He confronted the driver, yelling at him and questioning what the man was trying to do. The truck's driver, a stranger with wild eyes and quite possibly under the influence, responded by rolling down his window and spitting in Rob's face. A heated altercation ensued in the middle of the intersection. Rob, infuriated, struck back by punching the truck's side mirror, shattering it, and kicking the door in retaliation. The man in the truck continued to taunt them, growling and screaming, and reached down as if fumbling around for a weapon, prompting Rob to smash the driver's side window in self-defense. What had begun as a near accident and a brief roadside confrontation suddenly escalated into a life-or-death chase. The truck's driver gunned the engine and peeled out of the intersection, executing a sudden U-turn. Now it was clear to the bikers that this was no mere angry motorist. The man was turning his truck into a weapon. Rob later recounted that this was the moment that the men came to the realization that this psychopath was going to start mowing them all down. The friends on motorcycles sped off in different directions to evade the truck's wrath. Rob and Mike managed to make a quick right turn down a side street, successfully dodging the pursuing pickup. Lee, however, who had been slightly behind the others, took a left turn at the intersection, and in that split second, he became the lone target of the truck driver's fury. What followed was a terrifying high-speed pursuit through the darkened streets of Los Angeles. The truck driver fixated on Lee and chased him for miles across the city, reportedly reaching speeds of 60 to 100 miles per hour. Witnesses later recounted that the red and white truck stayed right on Lee's tail, attempting to bump his motorcycle repeatedly as the two vehicles barreled through the city. Lee, though he was an experienced rider, was now far out of his depth, fleeing for his life utterly defenseless against a four-wheeled battering ram. After approximately 5 miles of pursuit, the driver finally caught up to Lee. In a deadly maneuver, the truck rammed into the back of Lee's motorcycle at high speed, and the impact was truly devastating. Lee's bike was forced off the road and smashed into a telephone pole with a crushing force. As a result of this collision, Lee was thrown from the motorcycle and violently catapulted through the air. One witness estimated that Lee's body flew almost 180 feet before hitting the ground, an extremely grim testament to the speed and force of the collision. He landed on the pavement of La Cienega Boulevard, critically injured and unconscious. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the monster in the red and white truck didn't stop. The driver, who had turned an urban street into his hunting ground, sped off into the night, disappearing before anyone could catch a license plate number. Emergency responders rushed Lee Selwyn to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, fighting to save his life, but the injuries were too severe. Lee had suffered a massive skull fracture and other traumatic injuries when he struck the telephone pole and then the ground. In the hospital's intensive care unit, during the early hours of October 8th, 1988, Lee Selwyn succumbed to his wounds and died. A night of friendship and freedom on the road had been transformed into a scene of inexplicable horror. It was immediately clear to investigators that this wasn't a usual road rage incident. Someone had intentionally stalked and intentionally run down an innocent motorcyclist in an act of extreme violence. The question that now loomed large was, who was the crazed driver behind the wheel of that pickup truck, and why had he done this? Los Angeles authorities had a serious case on their hands, one as bizarre as it was brutal, and a perpetrator at large with no obvious motive. The news of Lee Selwyn's violent death sent shockwaves through both the music community and the city at large. In the days and weeks following the slaying, Lee's family and friends struggled with grief and disbelief. Hundreds of people attended Lee's funeral in October 1988, a testament to how widely loved he was. Among the mourners were around 700 friends and admirers, including an honor guard of 150 fellow motorcyclists who rode in procession as a tribute to Lee. But even while they mourned, Lee's friends and family were determined to find the person responsible for this cruel act. In the absence of an immediate arrest, they took it upon themselves to assist the police however possible. The friends who were with Lee that night became especially involved and active in the search for the perp. They helped create and distribute wanted posters citywide, posters emblazoned with a composite sketch of the suspect's face drawn from eyewitness descriptions. A composite sketch of the unknown driver, a Caucasian man in his late 20s or early 30s with a bushy reddish-brown beard and green eyes, was widely circulated. Despite these efforts, the case went cold, and the Los Angeles police admitted by the end of 1988 that they were at a loss for what happened. In a November 9, 1988 article in the Los Angeles Times, I found a rather unfortunate quote from a detective named Richard Iddings. Quote, "For some reason, some people, once they get behind the wheel of a car, they can do funny things." This statement, along with the cops throwing up their hands and admitting they're all out of ideas, ended up pissing off Angelenos. After all, it appeared that the cops had simply accepted that they wouldn't be able to resolve this case. In early 1989, with leads dwindling and community outrage high, the LAPD decided to try a then-novel approach, enlisting the help of a national television audience. True crime shows were just emerging as a phenomenon in the late 1980s, and Unsolved Mysteries was at the forefront of this new genre. The TV program, hosted primarily by Robert Stack, dramatized real, unsolved cases and urged viewers to call in with any information. On January 11, 1989, just 3 months after the event, the story of Lee Selwyn's death aired on Unsolved Mysteries. This had the effect of beaming the composite sketch and the details of that fateful night to tens of millions of households across America. Viewers from all over the country flooded the phone lines with possible leads. Some thought the sketch resembled someone they knew. Others reported encounters with aggressive pickup truck drivers in similar vehicles. A few even offered partial license plate numbers of suspicious vehicles. For the detectives, it was both encouraging and daunting. They now had quantity, but the challenge was sifting through for quality and determining if any of these hundreds of tips pointed to the real perpetrator. Unfortunately, In the months immediately following the broadcast, none of the clues brought them closer to identifying the suspect. Hundreds of tips were checked out, and all of them were ruled out. The bearded madman remained a ghost, haunting the streets of Los Angeles. According to contemporary interviews with the family, they were very grateful for the work Unsolved Mysteries did. That said, after all the leads turned up nothing, they resigned themselves to the potential reality that the case would never be solved. However, Unsolved Mysteries wasn't done with the case. As the show's popularity grew, it went into syndication, and reruns of past episodes began airing on various channels in the early 1990s. The Lee Selwyn segment, being a high-profile and dramatic case, generated new tips each time it was rebroadcast. According to contemporary interviews, the lead detective on the case viewed each rerun of the episode as a sort of dividend payment, with the currency being leads. The critical moment finally came in March 1993, nearly 4.5 years after that fateful night. On March 15th, 1993, Lifetime Television aired a rerun of the Unsolved Mysteries episode about Lee's case. Among the viewers that day was someone who knew a man who bragged about running down a biker in Los Angeles. When this viewer saw the reenactment and the composite sketch on screen, the puzzle pieces fell into place. An anonymous call came into the show's tip line, and this time it was the call detectives had been awaiting for years. The tipster pointed to a specific individual, a 36-year-old man named Franklin LeGrand Perkins. Perkins wasn't in California at all. He was an inmate at a prison in Georgia, serving time on an unrelated weapons possession charge. According to the tip, Perkins had allegedly boasted to a fellow inmate about running down a motorcyclist on the streets of Los Angeles years earlier. This was exactly the kind of bizarre confession that might easily have gone unnoticed or unreported. Prison bragging isn't usually communicated to police except in jailhouse snitch cases, but the broadcast connected the dots for the tipster. The caller provided enough detail to get the attention of LAPD investigators, who quickly looked into Perkins's background. What they found was startling and busted the case wide open. Perkins matched the description of the suspect almost perfectly, down to the age and hair color, and he had been in Southern California around the time of Lee's slaying. Once Franklin Perkins was identified as the prime suspect, the wheels of justice began to turn quickly. At the time the tip came in 1993, Perkins was only days away from being released on parole from the Georgia prison, where he was serving a 5-year sentence. Los Angeles authorities knew they had to act fast to keep him from walking free. Working with Georgia officials, the cops obtained a mugshot of Perkins and assembled a photo lineup. Lee's friends, including those who had seen the perp on the night of the attack, were shown the lineup, and they all picked Perkins' photo out as the man who had driven the truck. He's a distinctive-looking guy after all, not a face you're going to forget even under regular circumstances. That was the confirmation investigators needed. Just 5 days before Perkins's scheduled release date, on July 30th, 1993, he was served with an arrest warrant and indicted for the mowing down of Lee Selwyn. Instead of walking out of prison a free man, Franklin Perkins was placed in handcuffs and soon extradited 2,000 miles west to Los Angeles to face a first-degree charge. Notably, the fact that the tip came from across the country highlighted the massive geographical reach of these burgeoning true crime programs like Unsolved Mysteries. Without the show, it's highly unlikely that the tipster would have even known where to direct the clue. In 1994, Franklin Perkins stood trial for the slaying of Lee Selwyn. The evidence, accumulated over years, was presented to a jury and they found him guilty. A judge later sentenced Perkins to 15 years to life, after the jury found that Perkins didn't act in a premeditated manner. By all accounts, Perkins remained unrepentant. He had pleaded not guilty, and after his conviction, he continued to maintain his innocence. Over the years, he became eligible for parole hearings. The first was in 2005, but he was denied release each time, deemed still a risk and unsuitable for parole. In 2020, decades into his incarceration, Perkins even filed a petition for resentencing under a California law meant to reconsider certain convictions, but that too was denied. As of 2025, Franklin Perkins remains in prison, serving out his sentence for the slaying of Lee Selwyn. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, reminding you that if you like this sort of content, check out my other channel, Lazy Chill True Crime, for more solved cases. 16-year-old Joyce McLain was the kind of teenager who made her small town of East Millinocket, Maine, very proud. She was bright and talented. She was a popular cheerleader, honor student, and band member at Schenck High School. Joyce had displayed extraordinary musical ability from an early age, and even enjoyed composing her own songs. She had just earned her driver's license and was excitedly planning a beach party for her 17th birthday. To paraphrase what her mother Pam later said, Joyce was very excited to be heading into a new phase of her life. Unfortunately, this bright new phase of her life would never be Joyce's reality. On the warm evening of August 8, 1980, Joyce set out for a routine jog to get in shape for the upcoming soccer season. She left home around 7:30 p.m., running toward the fields behind her high school, and was seen heading into the twilight near the school grounds. This would be the last known sighting of her alive. When she failed to return home, her mother grew worried and drove around looking for her, but Joyce had vanished. Her mother quickly alerted police, and for 2 days and nights, family and friends combed the community for any trace of the missing teen. Then, on Sunday morning, August 10th, 1980, a volunteer searcher discovered a horror no one in East Millinocket ever expected. Joyce's lifeless body was found in the woods along a power line clearing behind Schenck High School's athletic fields. Her skull was crushed by a heavy blow, her hands were tied behind her back with a piece of cloth, and there were marks suggesting she had been strangled with an object. Her clothing was in disarray, but investigators determined she had not been subject to an indecent assault. The idyllic peace of East Millinocket was shattered by the grim discovery. In a town where doors were usually left unlocked, residents now found themselves afraid, wondering who could have done such a thing in their midst. Pam McLain publicly pleaded for anyone with information to come forward, vowing that neither she nor the perpetrator would ever know peace until he was caught. And yeah, spoiler alert, Pam was going to make good on this promise. The initial police investigation faced daunting hurdles. Detectives determined that Joyce had likely been slain the same night she went missing, but beyond that, hard evidence was scarce. One person did emerge early on as a potential suspect, 19-year-old Scott Fournier. In the pre-dawn hours after Joyce disappeared, Fournier had stolen a fuel truck from a local garage and crashed it a short distance from the school, suffering a serious head injury. He was in a coma for weeks afterward, and when questioned, Fournier initially claimed to remember nothing about that night. But in May 1981, he gave a statement to police that sounded like a confession, saying he might have beat Joyce while he was in a drunken haze. A few days later, he recanted that story, insisting he had only had a bad dream, and given the magnitude of his brain injury, this seemed plausible. Over the ensuing years, Fournier made several troubling remarks about the crime. He allegedly confessed to a pastor and separately to his own parents in the 1980s, and later even told a co-worker that he was responsible for Joyce's demise. In these retellings, he sometimes implicated other men, but investigators eventually ruled out all the people he named. Notably, Fournier knew details about the crime scene that had never been made public. For example, he described how Joyce's hands were tied behind her back. Still, without any physical evidence or a consistent, credible confession, police didn't charge Fournier or anyone else, and by the mid-'80s, Joyce McLain's case went cold. For the next 30-plus years, Joyce's family and neighbors kept her memory alive and the quest for justice ongoing. Pam McLain refused to let the authorities forget her daughter's case. She and the community formed a Justice for Joyce committee and held candlelight vigils on anniversaries associated with Joyce and the investigation. In 2008, nearly 28 years after the slaying, Pam's perseverance led to a dramatic turn. That year, with community fundraising support, Joyce's body was exhumed for a fresh forensic examination. Forensic specialists Drs. Michael Baden and Henry Lee conducted a new autopsy and announced that they had found physical evidence that gave investigators renewed hope. They didn't publicly disclose what the new evidence was, but it was the most significant break in the case in decades. Ultimately, it's unclear what this evidence was, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. At any rate, it's safe to assume that this evidence wasn't the potential bombshell it was thought to be. That said, sometimes causation has a funny way of working things out, and without this apparent dead-end path, Fournier likely would have gotten away with it. Following the exhumation, Maine State Police reopened the McLain investigation. Detectives in 2008 began re-interviewing witnesses and reviewing the case from scratch. In 2009, authorities publicly confirmed that Scott Fournier, long quietly suspected, was a person of interest in Joyce's slaying. As the cold case squad dug in, new witnesses emerged to bolster the case. One former colleague of Fournier's came forward with a story. Back in 1989, Fournier had suddenly blurted out a confession to him at work. Tips like these, combined with the forensic re-examination, strengthened the circumstantial case against Fournier piece by piece. After years of painstaking work, investigators and prosecutors concluded they finally had enough to secure a conviction. On March 4, 2016, nearly 36 years after the event, Maine State Police arrested 55-year-old Fournier and charged him. Fournier went on trial in January 2018, and he waived his right to a jury, leaving the verdict up to a judge. This was apparently a strategic move by his defense counsel in light of Fournier's multiple confessions over the course of the years. They had believed that a judge would be more likely to accept evidence that Fournier's statements were the result of a traumatic brain injury rather than any real commission of a crime. Given that this is a video on solved cases rather than unsolved mysteries, I'm sure I don't have to telegraph to you any further how well this strategy ultimately worked out. Because forensic evidence linking him to the crime was virtually non-existent, the prosecution's case focused on Fournier's own words and knowledge. They presented testimony about his multiple confessions over the years, and the specific details he knew about the crime scene that only the perpetrator would know. The defense argued that Fournier's so-called admissions were the unreliable ramblings of a man who had suffered a brain-damaging head injury on the night in question. His lawyers suggested that his memories were confused or imagined, and they pointed to other possible culprits. After hearing 2 weeks of evidence, Superior Court Justice Anne Murray rendered her verdict on February 22, 2018. She found Scott Fournier guilty in Joyce McLain's case, finally closing a chapter that had haunted the community for nearly 38 years. Justice Murray sentenced him to 45 years in prison, and in 2019, Maine's highest court upheld Fournier's conviction, ensuring that he remained behind bars. Ultimately, the slogan, "Justice for Joyce," was fulfilled, and this cold case was solved after a decades-long fight for truth and accountability. On the morning of July 8th, 1972, a passing motorist in rural Allen County, Indiana, came upon a heartbreaking scene. In a ditch along a quiet country road lay the body of a young mother, and beside her was her 3-year-old daughter, extremely frightened but miraculously unharmed. Just hours earlier, 26-year-old Phyllis Bailer had been alive and on a journey. The young mother had set out the previous evening from Indianapolis, driving a borrowed car to visit her parents in Bluffton, about 100 miles away, with her toddler in tow. When she failed to arrive, her worried family reported her missing. Early that next day, police found Phyllis's car abandoned on the shoulder of northbound Interstate 69 in nearby Grant County. The car's hood was propped open as if it had broken down, but Phyllis and her child were nowhere in sight. Approximately an hour later, the dreadful discovery was made. Phyllis's lifeless body and her little girl were spotted in a roadside ditch, miles from the highway. Investigators from the Allen County Sheriff's Department and the Indiana State Police rushed to the scene and launched an investigation. It was immediately clear that Phyllis had met a violent end, which was confirmed with certainty at the autopsy. It was also confirmed that the perpetrator had subjected her to the most disturbing form of assault, leaving behind the biological material that would ultimately crack the case. Her daughter, though physically unharmed, was too young to provide any useful details about what had happened. Detectives were left with a horrifying crime and very few initial clues. Phyllis's purse and belongings had presumably been in the car, but the car was found empty and in working order aside from the raised hood. Authorities could only theorize that Phyllis had experienced car trouble and that someone had taken advantage of her vulnerable situation. The remote location where her body was found suggested the perpetrator had driven her and her daughter off the interstate onto a secluded road to carry out this horrific act. In the summer of 1972, however, there were no surveillance cameras on highways, no cell phones to ping, and DNA analysis was decades away from being a useful tool. Investigators had to rely on old-fashioned police work, combing the area for witnesses and piecing together Phyllis's last known movements. In the immediate aftermath of Phyllis Bailer's slaying, police pursued every lead they could find. They interviewed other motorists who traveled I-69 that night, hoping someone might have seen Phyllis's green vehicle pulled over or noticed a stranger lurking near a distressed driver. They spoke with Phyllis's family and friends to determine if she had any enemies or troubled relationships that could suggest a suspect. Standard procedure in cases like this is to look first at those closest to the victim, a spouse, an ex-partner, or friends, but nothing indicated that someone in Phyllis's circle was responsible. From all accounts, Phyllis was simply a young mother on a routine trip. There was no obvious personal motive, which made the crime even more baffling and terrifying. It appeared to be a random act of violence. Before long, investigators developed at least one potential suspect based on the limited evidence and tips they had. Details about this early suspect were not released to the public, but authorities privately considered him a strong person of interest. Perhaps it was a local man with a history of violence, or a passerby who matched a description from a witness sighting. However, in 1972, they lacked the forensic evidence to make a charge stick, something that would actually turn out to be fortunate given subsequent developments. Despite their efforts, no arrests were made, and the case began to go cold. Families in the area were left to wonder if a predator was still among them, and Phyllis's loved ones were left with agonizing questions. Who attacked her, and why did this horrific monster decide to spare her child? The Phyllis Bailer case gradually became one of Indiana's most stubborn cold cases. For decades, Phyllis's family and in particular her daughter, received no answers. Periodic news stories recalled the tragic tale of the young mother found in the ditch, but as memories faded and investigators retired, the trail to her perpetrator seemed to all but disappear. Thankfully, it wasn't that police didn't have any evidence. They did recover physical evidence, but the perpetrator's identity remained hidden within it, literally at the molecular level. By the early 1990s, as DNA profiling emerged in forensic science, hope was rekindled. A partial DNA profile was eventually developed from biological material found on Phyllis's clothing, presumably from the assailant. When investigators compared this DNA profile against the man they had long suspected, the results were stunning. The partial profile eliminated their main suspect. It was now 2 decades after the crime, and the authorities were back to square one. Throughout the following decades, the Indiana State Police Cold Case Unit periodically revisited it, especially as DNA technology improved over the years. Each advance in forensic science brought a new opportunity to glean more information from the evidence, but for a long time, the DNA sample was too degraded or incomplete to point clearly to one individual. It yielded no matches in CODIS, the FBI's database of convicted offenders, because the perpetrator might never have had his DNA taken in a criminal case, or he simply wasn't in the system. Meanwhile, as the decades went by, Phyllis's daughter grew into adulthood, believing that the man who committed this evil act was likely walking free. Little did she know she would soon find out that the man responsible for her mother's death had suffered a fate that would have caused a medieval inquisitor to furiously take notes. In 2024, the cold case detectives investigating Phyllis Bailer's slaying decided to leverage the latest cutting-edge technology. The Indiana State Police Laboratory re-examined the genetic material from Phyllis's clothing and managed to develop a much stronger DNA profile of the unknown suspect. This new profile was more complete, and thus far more useful for searching in modern DNA databases. Traditional law enforcement databases still didn't have a direct match, and the DNA profile didn't match with any known convicted offender. So investigators turned to an innovative method that has been solving cold cases around the country in recent years: forensic genetic genealogy. This is a painstaking process, building out family trees from distant cousins and obscure records, but it paid off, big time. By early 2025, the investigators had zeroed in on a name. After 53 years of mystery, the DNA left on Phyllis's clothing finally had a match in the family tree: Fred Allen Lineman. Lineman was a 25-year-old man originally from Anderson, Indiana, roughly 40 miles from Indianapolis, not far from Phyllis's starting point that night. He later lived in Michigan and had accumulated a significant criminal history by his mid-20s. According to police, he had no known connection to Phyllis Bailer. He was neither a family friend nor an acquaintance. This lack of any prior link explains why he was never on investigators' radar. Phyllis almost certainly didn't know him at all, a chilling hallmark of stranger-on-stranger violence. When detectives dug into the perpetrator's background, they uncovered an interesting footnote on his disturbing life. Lineman himself had died violently in the 1980s. In a grim twist of fate, this man who preyed on a stranded young mother later became the prey himself. Investigators learned that Lineman was slain in Detroit in 1985, under absolutely brutal and gruesome circumstances. Now, usually I don't go into too much detail out of respect for the victims of crime, but I'm going to make an exception here. Lineman, who was by then 37 years old, had crossed 2 very bad men. These 2 men spent some time working him over with a baseball bat, threw him in a dumpster, and then, potentially while he was still alive, lit the dumpster up. I naturally have to wonder if he questioned the life he lived and the acts he committed as the flames rose around him. The Indiana State Police announced the solved case publicly in April 2025, finally bringing a sense of resolution to this mystery 50 years in the making. Indiana authorities noted that if Lineman were alive, he would have been charged with Phyllis Bailer's slaying and prosecuted by the Allen County Prosecutor's Office. Some believe that Phyllis may not have been Lineman's first or last victim, and that he may be connected to other crimes. So far, it's unclear if the authorities are investigating this avenue, but given the random nature of his attack on Phyllis, it's strongly speculated that they are.